Hey everyone, and welcome back to Librarian Oasis. I'm Joshua.
And I'm Eleanor.
We're doing a deep dive today into a book that's all about, well, seeing the world more clearly, I guess you could say.
That's a great way to put it.
It's called Factfulness by Hans Rosling, his son Ola, and his daughter-in-law Anna. And it's
quite a book.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mind bender in the best way possible, I think.
I think so too. It really challenges you to rethink a lot of assumptions you may have about the world.
Yeah, for sure. Now, before we get too far into it, we definitely recommend grabbing a copy of Factfulness if you want to follow along, because this deep dive is really just going to give you a taste of the main ideas, but there's just so much richness in the book itself.
Absolutely. It's packed with stories and data and examples that really bring it to life.
So the book sets out on this mission to combat what the authors call devastating global ignorance.
Right.
Which is a pretty bold statement. But basically, they want us to see the world based on facts, not just our gut feelings or those doom and gloom headlines we see all the time.
And you see those everywhere.
Yeah. And if I'm being honest, I started reading it with a little bit of skepticism, like,
understandable.
Is the world really getting better? You know, we're constantly bombarded with news about climate change, poverty, war.
It feels very bleak out there sometimes.
So how do they try to convince us of this? Because they don't sugarcoat the problems, right?
No, they don't sugarcoat anything. But they start by kind of confronting us with this hard truth that most of us are just walking around with these outdated and often like completely inaccurate views of the world. They actually present this global survey where people, including, highly educated people, were asked basic questions about global trends like child mortality, poverty levels, access to electricity, basic things.
Interesting. Okay, I'm already interested. So what were the results of this survey?
Okay, so brace yourself, because this is where it gets kind of crazy. People consistently scored worse than random chance. Like, literally worse than if they had just guessed blindly.
Wow.
Like, they even compared the results to chimpanzees choosing answers randomly, and the chimps did better.
That's pretty humbling.
It is very humbling. It makes you wonder.
Yeah, so it's not just about, like, lacking information, right? It's something deeper.
Exactly. It's about how our brains are wired. The authors actually identified 10 instincts that they say distort our perception of the world and make us see things as like worse, more dramatic, more divided than they actually are.
Okay.
And they go through each one of those.
Well, let's talk about those instincts.
Yeah.
The first one they tackle is the gap instinct, right?
It's that gap instinct.
And that's something that I think we can all kind of relate to pretty easily. It's that tendency we have to kind of divide the world into these two distinct groups, the us and them, the rich and the poor, the developed and the developed.
Exactly. Like that old saying, like, we're living on different planets.
Right.
Yeah.
But the book argues that this gap is more of an illusion than reality.
Yeah. They say it's not this like stark divide that we often imagine. They actually introduce this idea of 4 income levels.
Okay.
And that's moving away from those outdated developed versus developing categories.
Right.
And what's fascinating is that they say that the majority of the world's population now lives somewhere in the middle, in levels 2 and 3. It's not this either.
So you're saying that the gap is actually filling up. We're kind of seeing a global middle class emerge.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really important point that they make. But our brains, with that gap instinct, we just kind of cling to that outdated image. It's like we're looking at this blurry picture, missing all the details in between the extremes.
Yeah. Can you give us an example from the book of maybe how this gap instinct kind of plays out in real life?
Yeah.
Something that might drive this point home for people.
Yeah, so Rosling himself had this experience where he was trying to convince the World Bank to stop using the terms developing and developed.
Interesting.
Because he was saying, like, the data is showing that this is not accurate anymore,
right.
But they were very resistant to it.
I can imagine it's hard to let go of those labels once they become so ingrained.
It is. And it's interesting because it took years of him pushing back on this. He even swallowed a sword during a presentation to make his point.
Wow. Okay, so he was really committed to this idea.
He was very committed to it. And it's a funny story, but it also shows how deep this gap instinct runs, even in organizations that, deal with global development.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the gap instinct makes us see a world divided into these two extremes when the reality is much more of a spectrum.
Yes.
What's the next instinct on their list?
Okay. So the next instinct is the negativity instinct.
Okay.
And this one's all about our tendency to focus on the bad news, the things that are going wrong. It makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Our ancestors had to be alert to danger in order to survive.
Right.
But today, it can make us feel like the world is constantly getting worse, even when the data shows otherwise.
Yeah, it's like that classic line, if it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah.
Bad news sells. And unfortunately, it also seems to just stick in our minds more easily.
It does. And they talk about how, the book doesn't shy away from acknowledging the very real problems that are facing the world. But they also highlight the incredible progress that has been made.
Yeah.
That often goes unnoticed.
Right.
Precisely because of this negativity instinct.
Can you give us a concrete example of this hidden progress that they highlight in the book? Something that maybe really showcases the power of kind of looking beyond those headlines.
Yeah, one of the most striking examples they give is the trend of global life expectancy.
Okay.
So despite all of the wars and famines and natural disasters, life expectancy has actually been steadily increasing for over 2 centuries. So in 1800, the global average life expectancy was just 31 years.
Wow.
Today, it's over 72.
That's more than double.
More than double.
That's amazing. I mean, it really puts things into perspective when you look at those long-term trends that we often miss when we're just bombarded with those negative daily headlines.
Exactly. And they say that, it's about actively seeking out that good news, engaging with the data that shows how far we've come, and letting that fuel our optimism. It's not about ignoring the problems, but it's about having a more balanced perspective.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to train yourself to see the good news and to celebrate those wins, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they would agree with that.
Okay, so we've got the gap instinct, the negativity instinct, and I think the next one they talk about is the straight line instinct.
Yes, the straight line instinct.
Okay, so this one is a little more abstract.
Yeah.
What's the danger of straight lines? I mean, they seem to represent progress, moving forward in a consistent direction.
Well, sometimes. But the problem is that the world rarely operates in straight lines. It, zigzags, it curves, it takes these unexpected turns.
Right.
And the straight line instinct kind of makes us assume that a trend will continue in the same direction indefinitely.
Okay.
And that can lead to some wildly inaccurate predictions.
Can you give an example of how this plays out in the real world?
Yeah, so they talk about the Ebola outbreak in 2014.
Oh, yeah.
And Rosling was following the data very closely, and at first it was terrifying.
I can imagine.
The number of cases was doubling every 3 weeks.
Wow.
And if that trend had continued in a straight line, it would have been a global catastrophe.
Yeah, I remember that outbreak. I mean, it was a really scary time.
Absolutely. And it seemed like it was just going to keep getting worse and worse.
Right.
But then something really interesting happened. The trend line flattened. The doubling stopped.
Why? What happened?
Well, because of this massive global effort to contain the outbreak, to educate people and provide treatment.
So the straight line instinct in that case would have led us to just panic and despair, when in reality there was reason to hope.
Exactly. And they argue that it's the same with so many other global trends like population growth.
Right.
We tend to look at a graph showing, population increasing and assume it's just going to keep going up forever.
Right.
But that's not actually what's happening.
You're talking about the idea that population growth is actually slowing down, right? Even though it feels like there are more people on the planet than ever?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The UN actually projects that world population will stabilize around 11 billion by the end of the century.
Really?
Yeah. And the reason for this is that as countries escape extreme poverty and child mortality rates decline, people start having fewer children.
So the key to stabilizing population isn't necessarily about, imposing limits or anything like that, but it's actually about improving people's lives.
Exactly. And it's another example of how our instincts can sometimes lead us astray. We see a straight line going up and we just assume the worst.
Right.
But the reality is much more complex and often more hopeful.
So we've got the gap instinct, the negativity instinct, the straight line instinct. What other kind of mental gremlins are we battling here?
Okay, so the next one is the fear instinct.
Okay, this one feels pretty self-explanatory. I mean, humans are hardwired to be afraid, right? It's kept us alive for millennia. But how does this instinct distort our understanding of the world today?
Well, it makes us focus on the things that scare us most, even if they're not the things that are statistically most likely to harm us.
Okay.
So we overestimate the danger of these dramatic, vivid events like plane crashes, terrorist attacks, natural disasters.
Yeah, I'm definitely guilty of that. I'm always checking those flight safety statistics.
Right. It's understandable. Those events are terrifying.
They are.
But statistically, they're far less likely to harm us than things like heart disease, car accidents, even the flu. So they encourage us to kind of step back from that and look at the actual data to calculate the real risks and to not let our fear instinct run wild.
So it's about fighting fear with facts.
Yeah.
I like that. Can you give us an example from the book that really highlights the danger of this fear instinct?
Yeah, there's this really sobering example about the aftermath of the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan.
Oh, okay.
So after the tsunami and the nuclear leak, there was this mass evacuation. People were understandably terrified of radiation exposure.
Right, of course.
But in the chaos of that evacuation, over 1,600 people died.
Really?
Yeah, mostly elderly people who just couldn't handle the stress and the upheaval.
Wow, I didn't realize the death toll was that high.
Yeah, and what's even more tragic is that not a single person has been reported to have died from the radiation leak itself.
So the fear was actually more deadly than the threat itself.
Exactly. In that instance, the fear, which was fueled by the media and our own instincts, proved far more deadly.
That's a really powerful reminder that we need to be careful not to let our fears distort our perception of reality.
Yeah.
Let's take a break here and come back. Welcome back to Librarian Oasis. Okay, so calculate the risks, look at the data, keep those fears in check. What other mental traps do they talk about in the book?
Okay, so the next one is the size instinct. And this one's all about how we tend to misjudge the scale of things.
Right.
We get fixated on these isolated numbers without considering the context.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a problem. We hear a big number, millions of people affected by something, and our brains just latch onto that without really understanding what it means.
Right, and they stress the importance of comparing and dividing numbers to get a more accurate picture. It's not just about the numbers themselves, but it's about understanding what those numbers mean in relation to other numbers.
Can you give us an example that kind of helps illustrate this size instinct?
Yeah, so they use the example of child mortality, which sadly is still a major issue in the world.
Right.
Every year, millions of children die before the age of 5.
It's a heartbreaking statistic.
It is. But if we only focus on that current number, we miss a crucial piece of information. That number has been steadily decreasing for decades.
Okay.
So in 1950, over 14 million children died. Today, it's less than 5 million. Still a tragedy, but also a testament to the incredible progress that we've made in areas like vaccination and sanitation.
So by comparing those current numbers to the historical data, we get a more nuanced and ultimately more hopeful perspective.
Exactly. It's about seeing the long-term trends, not just the snapshot.
Right.
And it's about recognizing that even these seemingly huge problems can be tackled with the right knowledge and effort.
It's about recognizing that progress is possible, even when we're facing these daunting challenges.
Exactly. And they provide a lot of examples in the book that really highlight that.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of comparing and dividing numbers. What other strategies can we use to kind of keep this size instinct in check?
Well, they also talk about being wary of lonely numbers. Like, don't just accept a single statistic at face value. Always ask for more information, more context.
Right.
And the book shares this great anecdote about Rosling working as a doctor in Mozambique. And he had a friend who was also a doctor who insisted on providing intensive care to every child who came to the hospital, no matter how dire their condition.
It sounds like a noble goal, wanting to save every child.
It does. But Rosling, being the data-driven guy that he was, he started calculating the costs and benefits.
Okay.
And he realized that by focusing all their resources on a few critically ill children, they were neglecting the basic healthcare needs of a much larger population.
So they were actually doing more harm than good in the long run.
Exactly. It was a classic case of misplaced priorities.
Yeah, it's a tough ethical dilemma, isn't it?
It is. But it highlights the need to kind of think critically about how we allocate resources to consider the impact on the larger population and to prioritize those interventions that have the greatest benefit for the most people.
So it's about being strategic with our compassion in a way.
Yeah.
Using data to guide our decisions and to make sure our good intentions are actually having the intended effect. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground already. We've got the gap instinct, negativity, straight lines, fear, and size. What other mental traps does factfulness help us to kind of navigate?
Okay, so the next one is all about how we categorize and make assumptions about groups. It's the generalization instinct.
Okay, and this feels like something that we encounter all the time. We're constantly bombarded with generalizations about different countries, cultures, even entire generations.
Exactly. And it makes sense. Our brains are wired to categorize, to create these shortcuts. It helps us make sense of the world.
Right.
But the problem is that generalizations often lead to oversimplifications and stereotypes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can you give us an example from the book of how this generalization instinct can go wrong? Something that really illustrates the point.
Yeah, they start the book off with this really hilarious anecdote about Rosling being invited to this dinner party.
Okay.
And insect larvae are being served as a delicacy. And he politely declines, which, surprises and offends the host who can't understand why he wouldn't want to eat something that they consider delicious.
Right. So they were generalizing their own cultural preferences, assuming that what they found appealing must be universally appealing.
Exactly. And it's a funny story, but it highlights how easy it is to fall into that trap of assuming that everyone within a group thinks or behaves the same way.
Yeah, it's like judging an entire book by its cover, or an entire culture by a single custom.
Exactly. And they encourage us to challenge those generalizations by seeking out diverse examples.
Right.
By flipping perspectives and by traveling to experience different cultures firsthand.
Yeah, travel can be such a powerful way to break down those stereotypes and to really broaden our understanding of the world.
It is. And Rosling actually talks about how he used to take his medical students from Sweden on these study visits to hospitals in lower-income countries.
Wow.
And he said it was a completely different experience than just reading about poverty and disease in textbooks.
Right.
They were able to see the realities firsthand, meet the people affected, and really understand the complexities of the issues.
It's about going beyond the abstract and connecting with those human stories behind the statistics.
Exactly.
Okay, so challenge generalizations. Seek out diverse examples and get out there and experience the world for yourself. What other strategies do they recommend for kind of combating this generalization instinct?
Another one they highlight is flipping the perspective.
Flipping the perspective.
Yeah.
I like that. Can you give us an example of how that works in practice?
Yeah, so they use the example of women's access to contraception.
Okay.
And many people, especially in Western countries, kind of assume that access to contraception is low in parts of the world, particularly in Africa or the Middle East.
Right. It's a generalization based on those cultural or religious narratives that we often hear.
Exactly. But the reality is that access to contraception is actually quite high in many of those regions.
Really?
Yeah. They point out that countries like Iran, Thailand, even China have higher rates of contraceptive use than some European countries.
Wow. Okay, that really flips the script.
It does. And that's the power of flipping the perspective.
Yeah.
It forces us to question our assumptions and to see the world with fresh eyes.
So challenge generalizations. Seek out diverse perspectives and flip the script whenever possible. This is starting to feel like a mental workout routine for a more accurate worldview.
It is. It's about being more intentional with our thinking.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so what's the next instinct on their list?
This one is the destiny instinct.
The destiny instinct. Okay, what's that all about?
It's that idea that certain things are inevitable,
Okay.
that cultures and societies are fixed and unchanging. It's always been this way, so it always will be.
Right.
But they argue that this is a really dangerous misconception.
So it's about challenging the idea that, some cultures are destined to be poor or backward.
Right.
That progress is somehow predetermined.
Exactly. And they highlight how many countries that were once considered, poor have made incredible strides in recent decades.
Yeah.
Think about South Korea, Singapore, even China.
Right.
They were all once considered developing countries with low incomes and high poverty rates. But through education investment and good governance, they've transformed themselves.
It's a reminder that change is possible, that progress isn't this fixed destiny, but it's something that we can actively shape.
Exactly.
So how do they recommend we kind of combat this destiny instinct?
Well, one thing is just stay open to new data.
Right.
Be willing to update your knowledge. The world is constantly changing, and we need to kind of keep up with that. Another one is talk to grandpa.
Talk to grandpa. Okay, that's an interesting one. What's the thinking behind that?
Well, it's about recognizing that values and beliefs change over time.
Yeah.
Our grandparents grew up in a very different world than we did.
Of course.
And their views on things like gender roles, race, technology are likely very different from ours.
Right.
And it's a way to kind of see that cultural change in action.
Right, within our own families?
Yeah, exactly. And it helps us see that what seems fixed and immutable today might be completely different tomorrow.
It's a reminder that the future is not predetermined. We have the power to shape it.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The gap instinct, negativity, straight lines, fear size, generalization, destiny. It's like we're peeling back layers of misconception, one instinct at a time. What's the final instinct that Rosling kind of tackles into the book?
Okay, so this last one is the single perspective instinct.
The single perspective instinct. Okay, I have a feeling this one's going to resonate with a lot of people.
Yeah, it's that tendency we have to oversimplify complex problems and look for that single solution, that single lens through which to understand everything.
Right.
But they argue that this is a dangerous oversimplification.
So it's about recognizing that the world is messy and nuanced and interconnected.
Yeah.
That there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do we avoid falling into this trap of the single perspective instinct?
Well, one strategy is to actively seek out diverse perspectives.
Okay.
So read books and articles from authors with different backgrounds, different viewpoints. Talk to people who disagree with you. Challenge your own echo chamber.
Get out of your comfort zone.
Exactly.
It's about being open to being wrong, to having our assumptions challenged,
Absolutely.
to seeing the world through multiple lenses.
Yes. And they actually use this analogy of hammers and nails.
Okay.
So if your only tool is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail.
I like that.
In other words, if you're an expert in one particular field, you might be tempted to apply that expertise to every problem, even when it's not appropriate.
So it's about recognizing the limits of our own expertise and being open to learning from others.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the key messages of the book is that the world is complex and interconnected and constantly changing.
Right.
And we need to be humble and curious and willing to embrace multiple perspectives if we really want to understand it.
It's a powerful reminder that no one has a monopoly on truth.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that all of these instincts that we've been discussing are not inherently bad.
Right.
They served our ancestors well. They helped them to survive in a very dangerous world.
Right.
But in today's world, which is so complex and interconnected, they can lead us astray, distort our understanding of reality, and prevent us from seeing the progress that's actually being made.
It's like we need to update our mental software to be more compatible with the world we live in today.
I love that.
We're trading in those old instinctive operating systems for something more nuanced, more fact-based, more capable of processing all the complexities that we see around us.
Exactly. And that's what's so exciting about this book is that it provides a framework for doing just that.
Yeah.
It gives us the tools to see the world more clearly, to make better decisions, and to contribute to creating a more just and sustainable future.
Okay, I'm definitely feeling more equipped to navigate the world after kind of this deep dive into Rosling's instincts.
Yeah.
But I have to admit, there's still a part of me that struggles with that initial question. Like, is the world really getting better? It's easy to get caught up in the negativity, the headlines, the sense that everything is kind of falling apart.
I understand that feeling. I think we all grapple with that.
Yeah.
But I think this book offers a really powerful antidote to that despair. It encourages us to engage with the data, to challenge our assumptions, and to see the world with a renewed sense of hope and possibility. And I think that's a message that we all need to hear now more than ever.
Absolutely. And we'll delve further into those specific ways that factfulness challenges our assumptions and empowers us to take action in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it.
Let's take a break here and come back. Welcome back to Librarian Oasis.
So we've been talking a lot about how factfulness kind of helps us dismantle all of these mental roadblocks that prevent us from seeing the world clearly.
Right.
But the book goes beyond just debunking myths. It actually offers like a set of tools, almost like a fact-based worldview toolkit, I guess you could call it,
Okay.
to help us make better decisions both personally and globally.
I like it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've identified the problems, those pesky instincts. Now let's talk about solutions. How do we actually put this factfulness into practice?
Yeah, well, one of the key tools they introduce is this idea of using data as therapy.
Data as therapy.
Yeah.
That sounds interesting. So is this like a prescription for a daily dose of spreadsheets or something?
Not quite. It's more about recognizing that we're constantly being bombarded with negative news.
Yeah.
And, that can really lead to this sense of hopelessness and despair.
It's true. It can feel like our brains are marinating in negativity sometimes.
Right. And it can be hard to see beyond that. But the book reminds us that by looking at the data at the long-term trends,
Yeah.
we can actually see a very different picture.
Yeah.
A picture of steady progress in areas like child mortality,
Right.
poverty reduction, access to education.
So it's about actively seeking out those positive trends, those signs of progress that are often drowned out by all the negativity.
Exactly. It's not about ignoring the problems, but it's about having a more balanced perspective. It's about recognizing that even in the face of all these challenges, humanity has made incredible strides.
Yeah.
And that recognition can be incredibly empowering. It can fuel our optimism, and it can motivate us to work towards a better future.
Yeah. It's like finding those little rays of light that are breaking through the clouds. It doesn't erase the storm, but it gives you hope that the sun is still shining up there.
I love that analogy. I think that really captures the essence of what they're trying to do with this data as therapy approach.
Right.
It's about equipping ourselves with the knowledge and the perspective to kind of see beyond the immediate crisis and to tap into that deep well of human resilience and ingenuity.
I like that. Okay, so we've got data as therapy as one tool in our Factfulness toolkit.
Yeah.
What other strategies do they recommend for putting this worldview into action?
Another important one is recognizing that progress is often gradual and incremental.
Okay.
It's about kind of shifting away from that dramatic, everything is falling apart narrative.
Right.
And embracing a more nuanced understanding of how change actually happens.
So it's about looking for those small, steady improvements rather than expecting like these overnight revolutions.
Exactly.
Huh.
And they remind us that most of the big improvements in human history have happened slowly over time, often without a lot of fanfare.
Right.
It's like that famous saying about the bamboo tree.
Oh, yeah.
It takes 5 years for the roots to grow underground, and then it shoots up 90 feet in 6 weeks.
That's such a good metaphor because, we often don't see those crucial foundational shifts happening beneath the surface.
Yeah,
We only notice that dramatic burst of growth at the end.
exactly. And that's why they encourage us to celebrate those small wins.
Yeah.
To acknowledge the progress that's happening even when it's not making headlines.
Yeah, it's like shifting our attention from the dramatic fireworks to the slow, steady burn of a campfire.
I love that.
Both have their own beauty and their own power.
Exactly. It's about appreciating the different paces of progress, the different ways in which positive change unfolds in the world.
I like it. Okay, so we've got data as therapy. We've got recognizing the gradual nature of progress. What other things can we add to our arsenal?
Okay, so this next one might sound a little counterintuitive,
Okay.
but it's incredibly important. Embracing uncertainty.
Embracing uncertainty. But isn't factfulness all about facts? About having a clear, accurate understanding of the world?
It is. But they also acknowledge that the world is complex.
Yeah.
It's constantly changing and it's full of unknowns.
Of course.
And they say clinging to certainty, clinging to that black and white thinking,
Right.
can actually blind us to those nuances and
Yeah.
prevent us from adapting to new information.
So it's about being comfortable with the gray areas, with the fact that we don't have all the answers.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging the limits of our knowledge
Right.
and being open to revising our opinions as new data emerges.
It's about having the humility to say, I don't know, but I'm willing to learn.
Yes. And that openness, that willingness to embrace uncertainty is essential for making sound judgments in a world that's constantly throwing us curveballs.
Embracing uncertainty. Okay. I'm starting to see how that fits into this whole factfulness framework. It's about being mentally flexible, adaptable,
Yeah.
willing to update our mental maps as the terrain changes. What other strategies do they recommend?
Okay, so this one's all about how we frame our understanding of problems and solutions. It's about avoiding the blame game
Okay.
and focusing on finding practical, effective solutions.
So it's about moving beyond pointing fingers and getting down to the business of actually making things better.
Exactly. And they remind us that blaming individuals or groups rarely leads to constructive solutions.
Right. It usually just creates more division and resentment.
Exactly. And it diverts energy away from actually finding those practical ways to address the problem.
It's like that old saying, if you're pointing a finger, there are 3 fingers pointing back at you.
Exactly. It's about taking responsibility,
Right.
both individually and collectively, for creating a better world.
Can you give us an example of how this plays out in the real world.
Right.
How we can shift from that blame to a more solutions-oriented thinking.
Yeah, so they talk about the issue of child labor,
Okay.
which is obviously a very complex and heartbreaking problem.
Absolutely.
And it's easy to point fingers at, the companies that employ children in their factories.
Right.
Or the governments that fail to enforce labor laws.
So the natural reaction to want to find someone to blame.
It is.
Yeah.
But they argue that, simply blaming those actors doesn't actually help the children who are suffering.
Right.
Instead, they encourage us to look for more systemic solutions, like investing in education, creating economic opportunities for families,
Right.
and supporting organizations that are working to protect children's rights.
So it's about looking at the bigger picture, understanding the underlying causes of a problem.
Yeah.
And finding ways to address those root causes rather than just treating the symptoms.
Exactly. It's about moving from blame to understanding,
Right.
from judgment to action.
Okay, I like that. Avoid the blame game focus on finding solutions.
Yeah.
What other practical tools do they give us in this Factfulness toolkit?
Well, this next one is about taking a more holistic approach to problem solving.
Okay.
They advocate for what they call a fact-based worldview,
Okay.
which means looking at issues from multiple perspectives,
Right.
considering all the relevant data
Okay.
and being open to different approaches.
So it sounds like a recipe for avoiding those single perspective traps that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that complex problems rarely have simple solutions.
Right.
They often require these multifaceted approaches that kind of address the issue from different angles.
Can you give us an example of how this fact-based worldview approach might play out in a real-world situation?
Yeah, they use the example of healthcare in different countries.
Okay.
And they point out that, there's no single best healthcare system. Different
Yeah.
countries have different strengths and weaknesses.
Of course.
And what works well in one context might not be appropriate in another.
Right, so it's about being adaptable, finding the right solutions for the specific circumstances.
Exactly. It's about letting go of that ideological rigidity and embracing a more pragmatic, data-driven approach to problem solving.
So it's about asking what works, not what fits my preconceived notion.
Exactly. It's about being willing to learn from other countries to adapt successful strategies to different contexts and to constantly evaluate and refine our approaches based on the evidence.
Okay, I'm really starting to see how this Factfulness toolkit is coming together.
Yeah.
We're equipping ourselves with data as therapy, recognizing the gradual nature of progress,
Right.
embracing uncertainty, avoiding the blame game, and adopting this fact-based worldview. Are there any other tools we can add to our arsenal?
Yes. And this one is crucial. Taking action.
Okay, this feels like the natural culmination of all of these insights.
Yeah.
We've challenged our assumptions, we've broadened our perspective,
Right.
we've embraced a more fact-based worldview. Now it's time to actually put that knowledge into practice.
Exactly. They argue that knowledge is most valuable when it's applied, when it leads to positive change in the world.
Right. But they also acknowledge that taking action can be really daunting.
Yeah.
Right? Especially when we're facing these huge systemic problems like poverty, inequality, climate change.
Yeah.
It can feel like our individual actions are just a drop in the ocean.
They do acknowledge that, and it's a valid concern.
Yeah.
But they also remind us that individual actions, when multiplied by millions, can actually create a really powerful ripple effect.
Of course.
They encourage us to find our own spheres of influence,
Right.
whether it's in our families, our communities, our workplaces, and use our knowledge and our voices to advocate for change.
So it's about finding those leverage points where our individual actions can have the greatest impact.
Exactly. And they actually offer some really practical tips for doing just that.
Okay, I'm eager to hear those tips.
Yeah.
Where do we start?
Well, they suggest starting by identifying your own personal superpower.
Okay.
So what are you good at? What are you passionate about? What skills, resources, or connections do you have that can be used to make a difference?
So it's about finding that sweet spot where our passions and our abilities kind of intersect with the needs of the world.
Exactly. And they remind us that, even small actions can make a difference.
Of course.
It could be as simple as talking to your friends and family about these issues, sharing the insights you've gained from the book, and helping to spread a more fact-based worldview.
It's about planting those seeds of awareness, sparking conversations, and helping other people to see the world through a new lens.
Exactly. And those conversations can lead to bigger actions, to collective efforts that can create real change.
So it's about recognizing our individual power, finding our superpowers, and then joining forces with others to create that ripple effect of positive change.
Exactly. And they provide the framework, the set of tools, and the inspiration to help us do just that.
This has been an incredible journey so far. Let's take a break here and come back. Welcome back to Librarian Oasis. We've explored those 10 instincts. We've debunked some common myths about the world, and we started to build our Factfulness toolkit. I'm already feeling more empowered to navigate this complex world. What other insights await us in the final part of our deep dive?
Well, we'll explore some specific examples of how this factfulness approach can be applied to real-world problems.
Oh, exciting.
From global health to education to business.
Okay, can't wait to delve into those practical applications. It's about moving beyond just understanding the world to actually changing it for the better. We've spent the last parts of this deep dive really getting into the nitty-gritty of factfulness.
Yeah, all those instincts.
Yeah, exploring those 10 instincts that can really cloud our judgment, and we've started building this like factfulness toolkit.
We have our toolkit.
But I think one of the most important questions we need to address now is, so what? You know, we've gained all these insights, we've kind of sharpened our thinking, but how do we actually put this factfulness into practice in our everyday lives?
Right, like how do we actually use this stuff?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's a great question, and I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about this book is that they don't just leave you hanging with all this information.
Right.
They actually dedicate a whole section to exploring the practical applications
Oh, cool.
of this worldview. And they even provide like specific recommendations for different sectors like education, business journalism, global development.
Okay, so they get really into the weeds of it.
They do.
Awesome. Let's dive into that. Where do they suggest we start?
Well, they argue that education is one of the most powerful tools we have
Makes sense.
for shaping a more factful future.
Yeah, education is all about equipping people with the knowledge and the critical thinking skills
Right.
necessary to navigate the world.
Exactly. But they also kind of critique the way that a lot of schools are still teaching about the world. You know, clinging to those outdated developed versus developing narratives.
Right.
And focusing on problems in low-income countries without really providing that balanced perspective.
It's like they're inadvertently perpetuating that gap instinct that we talked about.
Exactly, they are. And they say, you know, we need to update our curricula
Yeah.
to reflect the reality of the world today. A world where, you know, the majority of people are living in middle-income countries, where progress is happening, and where we need to understand global interconnectedness more than ever.
So it's about teaching students to be global citizens, basically equipped with the knowledge and the critical thinking skills to navigate this complex and rapidly changing world.
Yes. And they talk about, you know, beyond just teaching facts.
Right.
They emphasize the importance of fostering a certain mindset.
Yeah.
You know, a mindset of curiosity, humility, a willingness to challenge assumptions.
Right. It's not just about memorizing statistics. It's about cultivating a way of thinking, a way of engaging with the world.
Yes.
That's grounded in facts, but also open to new information, different perspectives.
Exactly. It's about fostering that lifelong love of learning, a thirst for knowledge, and a commitment to using that knowledge to make the world a better place.
I love that. Okay, I'm definitely sold on the importance of education for a more factful future.
Yeah.
But what about the business world? How can factfulness be applied in that realm?
Well, they argue that having that fact-based understanding of global trends is crucial for making sound business decisions.
Yeah.
Especially in today's interconnected economy.
Right, like if you're a company operating in, let's say, North America, you might assume that your future growth is going to come from those same markets.
Right.
But the reality is that the fastest growing markets are often in Asia, Africa, and other regions.
Exactly. They encourage businesses to look beyond their traditional markets.
Yeah.
And to really see the opportunities that exist in these emerging economies.
So it's about being data-driven, not just in our personal lives, but also in our professional decisions.
Yeah.
Understanding the global landscape, identifying those emerging trends, and being willing to adapt to this rapidly changing world.
Absolutely. And they also highlight the importance of ethical considerations in business.
Yeah.
Especially when operating in different cultural contexts, you know, emphasizing the need for cultural sensitivity, respect for local customs, and a commitment to operating in a way that benefits both the company and the communities they work with.
So moving beyond that old profit at all costs mentality,
Mm.
and recognizing that sustainable business practices, ones that actually take into account the well-being of people and the planet,
Yeah,
are ultimately in everyone's best interests.
exactly. And that kind of brings us to another area where factfulness is so crucial.
Journalism.
Ah, yes, journalism. We've talked a lot about how the media often plays a role in perpetuating those negative biases and those fear-mongering narratives.
Right.
What does factfulness have to say about that?
Well, they acknowledge the important role that journalism plays in a democracy.
Mhm.
They emphasize the need for a free press that can hold power to account and inform the public.
Of course.
But they also offer a pretty scathing critique of the way that news is often reported.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. We've talked a lot about how those negativity and fear instincts are often amplified by the media's focus on the dramatic, the sensational, those things that really scare us.
Exactly. And they say, while it's important to report on those issues, we also need to be reporting on the progress that's being made,
Right.
on the solutions that are working,
Yeah,
on the positive trends that are often overlooked.
it's about providing a more balanced and nuanced picture of the world,
Right.
right? One that acknowledges the challenges, but also highlights those signs of hope and progress.
Exactly. They argue that journalism has a responsibility not just to inform, but also to empower, to inspire, and to give people a sense of agency.
I like that. They even give some specific guidelines for journalists on how to report on global issues in a more factful and constructive way, right?
Yeah, they really do. They get into the nitty-gritty of it.
Okay, so education, business journalism, all areas where this factfulness approach can have a real impact. But it's not just about applying these principles to specific sectors, right?
Mhm.
It's also about cultivating this worldview in ourselves and in the people around us.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most important things we can do is to start asking better questions.
Asking better questions.
Right.
Okay, I like that. What do you mean by that?
Well, instead of just accepting the information that we're given,
Right.
whether it's from the news, social media, even our own families,
Yeah.
we need to start asking, where did this information come from? Is it reliable? Is it representative? What's the bigger picture? What are the other perspectives on this issue?
So developing a healthy skepticism, that
Mhm.
critical thinking mindset, not just blindly accepting what we're told, but really digging deeper, questioning our assumptions,
Mhm.
and seeking out that more complete and nuanced understanding.
Exactly. And they argue that that kind of critical thinking is essential, not just for understanding these big global issues, but also for just navigating our everyday lives.
Right, for making those decisions in our own lives.
Exactly. It helps us make better decisions, helps us avoid those instinctive traps, and just become more informed and engaged citizens.
So we're equipping ourselves with a mental toolkit, a set of skills that will help us to navigate this complex and ever-changing world with more clarity, more confidence, and more compassion.
I love that. And I think that's what's so powerful about this book. It's not just a book of facts and figures.
Right.
It's really a guide to thinking, a way of approaching the world that empowers us to see beyond those headlines, to challenge our assumptions, and to contribute to creating that more just and sustainable future.
I absolutely love that. This deep dive has been so eye-opening for me. It's challenged my own assumptions, broadened my perspective, and honestly, it's given me a renewed sense of hope for the future.
Yeah.
I highly recommend picking up a copy of Factfulness if you haven't already.
I second that recommendation. It's one of those books that can truly change the way you see the world.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Factfulness. And to all our listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and tools to help you navigate the world with more factfulness and a renewed sense of possibility. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep challenging those assumptions.